Hello, and welcome to the fifth webinar in our Lunch, Learn, and Dance Wellness webinar series, Radiation Protection in the Operating Room. I am Lynn McDonald, Liaison Scientist with the Radiation Safety Institute of Canada. Joining me in our chat room are our Training Manager, Tara Hargraves, Maria Costa, and Angelo de Torres from Steps Dance in Toronto. He will lead us in dance beginning at 12:30. Let's take a moment to go over the functionality of the Zoom webinar. The audio and video will be from the presenters only. We have found that although you can access the audio through the computer or telephone, the quality of sound tends to be better when listening from a computer. There's a chat feature where people can discuss. If you would like, take a moment now to say hello and where you're from. If you have any questions arising from the content, please enter them under the Q&A section. As the webinar is only half an hour in length and is immediately followed by our dance session, time may not permit me to answer them during the webinar. The answers will be posted on our website, along with a link to the video recording and a copy of the slides. This can be found under Education Webinars. I will be sending a confirmation of attendance email after the webinar and will include a link to the page with that communication. I will also include the topics covered and the length of time spent in the webinar, as some people have requested this to send to the Professional Association. Lastly, I have automatic closed captioning enabled in the slide presentation. If they're being blocked by your Zoom controls, you should be able to select a different way to view the webinar in Zoom, which makes them easier to see. In this session, we will look at sources of radiation, health effects of radiation, regulators, and radiation protection principles. We will then go into radiation safety as it applies to an operating room setting and dosimetry. Radiation is widely used in modern medicine. X-rays, CT scanners, particle accelerators, and nuclear sources are used for the imaging, diagnosis, and treatment of a wide variety of conditions. When thinking of exposures in the workplace and the community, many people picture those involved with the nuclear power industry. However, when we look at the breakdown of who was monitored for occupational radiation exposures in Canada, it is apparent that there are more workers monitored for radiation exposure in medicine than in all other industries combined. Radiation is widely used in modern medicine. X-rays, CT scanners, particle accelerators, and nuclear sources are used. In the operating room, two sources of occupational exposure are sentinel node biopsy and fluoroscopy procedures. In sentinel node dissection, a radioactive tracer or dye is injected into an area near a tumor. A handheld meter is used to measure the radiation coming out of the patient. This helps the doctor to see how lymph travels from the tumor to the lymph nodes, so they can remove a node or two to check for cancer. Technetium-99m, a gamma emitter, is commonly used. During fluoroscopy, an X-ray machine is used to image the patient. An image intensifier records the radiation that goes through the patient. Fluoroscopy provides real-time imaging, and as such, there's continuous or continuous intermittent X-ray exposures during the procedure. Fluoroscopy is used as part of examinations and procedures such as barium X-rays and enemas, the insertion and manipulation of catheters and stents, angiograms, and during orthopedic surgery. In order to explain the occupational risks associated with exposure to radiation and the resulting radiation safety practices, we first need to explain a bit about what radiation is. We will go through this briefly, as it is explained more fully in other webinars in the series. No matter what the source, radiation can be categorized as ionizing or non-ionizing. Ionizing radiation has enough energy to remove electrons from atoms. When this happens, it could cause the bonds that hold molecules together to break apart. On a larger scale, if this type of radiation hits living material, it could kill cells or cause damage to their DNA. Non-ionizing radiation does not have enough energy to remove electrons from atoms. Any damage that it does occurs mainly due to it heating up the substance it interacts with or photochemical effects. In sentinel node biopsy, although the radioactive tracers injected may emit other forms of radiation, these are shielded from the external people by the patient's body. The radiation that is externally emitted and detected is in the form of gamma radiation. Fluoroscopy equipment uses X-rays. Both of these are types of electromagnetic radiation. Physically identical to visible light, gamma and X-ray radiation are both in the high energy portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. Gamma and X-ray radiation are as damaging as beta radiation, which you may be familiar with, although they have no mass and carry no electric charge. With no mass or charge, gamma and X-ray radiation can potentially travel forever in materials. We can reduce the number of gamma rays or X-rays by shielding with thick layers of dense materials like lead or concrete. So how are they different? It's their source. Unstable atoms will emit gamma rays from their nucleus when they have too much energy. Gamma ray emission is preceded by an alpha or beta emission. Common sources are technetium-99m, cobalt-60, and iridium-192. X-rays are produced by machines hitting a target, such as a piece of tungsten with fast-moving electrons. It is important to remember that hitting a dense material with beta radiation or high-energy electrons can produce X-rays. This is useful when building an X-ray machine, as the outgoing X-ray radiation can be directed using a collimator so it will escape the device in a particular direction. But if the X-rays produced are not desirable, they must be shielded for as well. The effects of radiation depend on the amount of energy the radiation transfers to your body. This transfer of energy results in a radiation dose. There are several ways dose is reported, but a common measurement is the millisievert. When radiation interacts with living tissue, there are a number of possible outcomes. No damage at all, damage to cells that is repaired, and damage to cells that leads to cell death. This is concerning when there has been an exposure to a large amount of radiation, which caused large amounts of cells to die, as our cells die and are replaced in smaller numbers on a regular basis. We call the effects that are certain to happen over a threshold dose of radiation deterministic or tissue effects. Another possible effect of a radiation dose is damage to the cell chromosomes that is incorrectly repaired, which is called a mutation. This effect is of concern for chronic exposures to low doses of radiation. The resulting effects are stochastic in nature. A stochastic event is one that applies to increased risk of an outcome occurring. It is not going to happen with certainty. Radiation exposure increases the likelihood of developing cancer. With stochastic effects, the larger the exposure, the greater the chance the effect will occur. One familiar example of a stochastic effect is the connection between smoking and lung cancer. Smoking increases the risk of lung cancer, but not everyone who smokes will get lung cancer, and not everyone who has lung cancer ever smoked. The risk of developing a fatal cancer as a result of exposure to radiation is approximately 4% for every 1,000 millisieverts. Consider a person who worked for 50 years and received 20 millisieverts per year. This person's total lifetime radiation dose is 1,000 millisieverts. This person will have an extra 4% chance of developing a fatal cancer. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or CNSC, is the regulating body in Canada responsible for protecting the health, safety, and security of Canadians, as well as protecting the environment in relation to radioactive sources. Under the current regulations, radiation devices containing nuclear sources must be certified by the CNSC in order to be sold and processed. Unless the device contains an extremely small quantity of nuclear material, the owner must have a license from the CNSC. In a medical setting, radioisotopes such as tracers and equipment such as linear accelerators and gamma knife sources are regulated federally by the CNSC. X-ray equipment, with the exception of very high energy X-ray units, is provincially regulated. This is mentioned as the regulator will set out the occupational dose limits. For example, workers in an Ontario hospital might have two different sets of effective dose limits, depending upon if they're working with federally regulated nuclear sources or equipment or provincially regulated X-ray equipment. This may seem concerning, but one must remember that these limits are not cutoffs under which, if occupational dose is kept, all is fine. These are maximums. There's an overarching radiation safety principle of ALARA, as low as reasonably achievable, when it comes to occupational doses. By following safety protocols, doses in Canada are on average around 0.2 millisieverts per year, well under the effective dose limits. If dosimetry indicates that a worker is approaching the limit shown, it typically would be a cause for a review of the radiation safety program and adherence to such. We are all constantly exposed to some form of radiation or another. We live in a radioactive world, and it has been so since the beginning of time. We are continually exposed to high energy radiation from outer space called cosmic radiation. We are also exposed to the radiation emitted from naturally occurring radionuclides in the Earth. In fact, the air we breathe, the water we drink, and the food we eat all contain trace amounts of radionuclides. We also are exposed to radiation during certain medical procedures. This background radiation exposure gives Canadians approximately 2 to 4 millisieverts of ionizing radiation dose per year. If we compare this exposure to the maximum amount of occupational exposure a non-nuclear energy worker is allowed to get in 1 year, 1 millisievert, we can see how strict the national limit is. Here are some exposures which might typically occur to an average Canadian as compared with the regulatory dose limits. Recipients of medical radiation doses are not subject to the regulatory exposure limits, as it is up to the medical practitioner to balance the risks associated with the procedure with the need for imaging, diagnosis, and treatment. Acute exposure is a high dose delivered within seconds, minutes, or days. Acute exposures are uncommon but can still occur in the event of an accident or if radiation safety procedures are not followed. Deterministic or tissue effects are those which will occur if exposure is over a threshold dose. These include cataracts, blood changes, nausea, diarrhea, hair loss, skin damage, and death. When discussing deterministic effects, doses are typically reported in gray or milligray. Radiation doses leading to illness or death would only occur in the event of a severe accident involving a very large dose of radiation. As indicated, other than cataracts, deterministic or tissue effects are not generally observed below an acute dose of 250 milligray. Changes in the blood counts will occur at a dose of 250 milligray. Damage to skin and hair loss can occur at 3 to 5 gray. Acute doses of 3.5 to 5 gray can result in sterility. Acute doses of 1/2 gray can cause nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Over the last decade, new research has shown that the threshold dose for the formation of cataracts is around 500 milligray. As this is lower than previously thought, the International Commission on Radiological Protection, or ICRP, is currently recommending a dose limit for the lens of the eye of 20 millisieverts in a year, on average over 5 years, with no single year exceeding 50 millisieverts. The CNSC has lowered the annual dose limit for the lens of the eye to 50 millisieverts per year. Each province has its own limits for exposure to X-ray radiation. For example, Ontario's limit for the lens of the eye is currently set to 100 millisieverts per year for X-ray workers and 50 for other workers. Although radiation can cause physical harm, it has been used safely throughout the industry and medicine by having in place proper safety protocols and building of a safety culture in the workplace. Radiation can only do damage if it deposits its energy by interacting with matter. We cannot detect ionizing radiation with our senses, so we cannot trust ourselves to know how much radiation there is in any setting. It is therefore important to create habits which prevent radiation exposure. The fundamentals of radiation protection are to avoid acute effects from high radiation doses resulting in immediate injury or death, to minimize the likelihood of radiation-induced cancers, and to keep radiation exposures as low as reasonably achievable, or ALARA. For external radiation exposures, a cornerstone of worker protection are the radiation protection principles of time, distance, and shielding. These principles minimize the amount of radiation which gets the opportunity to interact with living things. The less time spent in a radiation field, the less dose a worker will receive. Therefore, it is important to minimize the time a person spends near a source, whether it is a radioactive isotope or a piece of equipment like an X-ray machine or CT scanner when turned on. This is accomplished by efficient work practices so that a procedure takes the minimum amount of time necessary to achieve its purposes. In the case of a fluoroscopy device, it is important to take as few images as possible and to use a pulse mode which gives the resolution needed, but not necessarily the best resolution the equipment can produce. There must be a balance between obtaining images of good enough quality to not have the procedure repeated and seeking the perfect images, which causes an excess amount of exposure to radiation. For many sources of radiation, the field intensity decreases the farther away you are from the source. The intensity of X-ray and gamma ray fields decreases as you increase your distance from the source. In the case of radioactive tracers, the patient is the source. In the case of X-ray or gamma cameras, both the equipment and the patient are the sources, as the electromagnetic radiation entering the patient will create backscatter. It is important to stay as far back from these sources as is reasonable when performing these procedures. Shielding is the main source of protection from exposure to X-rays and gamma rays. X-rays and gamma rays cannot be 100% stopped. Think of shielding like being like tinted glass for light. As the tinted glass becomes thicker and thicker, the light rays which get through get more and more dim. The tinted glass is not guaranteed to stop all the light passing through it, but at some thickness, the amount getting through falls practically to zero. This is similar to what lead and cement shielding does with gamma and X-ray fields. The radiation is attenuated or reduced in energy as it travels through the shielding. During sentinel node biopsy, the patient is the source of radiation. Efficient work practices, including good communication amongst staff, will reduce the time spent around the patient. Distance is increased by taking a few steps back from the patient when not taking a measurement or otherwise involved in the procedure. Shielding, including lead aprons, thyroid collars, and eye protection, will attenuate the gamma radiation. Although they are bulky, shielding PPE are an important part of protecting yourself from radiation exposure. Fluoroscopy presents a potential for high exposure due to working close to an open X-ray beam for potentially a long period of time. As previously mentioned, fluoroscopy involves the continuous or intermittently continuous use of X-rays for real-time imaging. Ideally, it is only the patient exposed to the primary beam. Therefore, others in the operating room receive radiation dose from the scattered radiation from structures within the patient and material in the room. Collimation should be used to reduce the field of view to only the area of interest. The main sources of scatter are from the patient and from the image intensifier. Use the patient as a shield when possible. Increase the tube current increases the number of X-ray produced by the equipment. You want to set the current strong enough to see your image, but no higher to reduce overexposure. The tube potential sets the energy of the individual X-rays created. Low energy X-rays get absorbed more by the skin. You want high enough energy to avoid excessive skin dose, but low enough to take into account contrast. The diagrams following show the relative dose levels of radiation field during a fluoroscopy procedure. Yellow indicates the lowest dose level, with dark red being the highest. The position of the X-ray tube is above the patient and the screen is at the bottom in this setting. Please note that this image shows image intensifiers, but most locations, these have been replaced by digital flat panel detectors. The important points to notice on these diagrams, you can see that the radiation fields are changed as you change the position of the X-ray tube and screen at different angles. And if you set it correctly, you will lower the strength of the radiation field for the operator. Important points are to be aware of everyone's position in the room. The X-ray tube should be below the patient. A screen should be as close to the patient as possible, and the X-ray tube should be pointed towards the operator if possible. This may seem counterintuitive, but the patient's body acts as a shield. This will lower the dose to vital organs of the operator. Fluoroscopy procedures have the potential to impart acute levels of ionizing radiation to patients and staff. Shielding and dosimetry are critical. Lead curtains can be installed on the patient table. Lead aprons should always be worn and should cover the thyroid, core, and reproductive organs. Lead glass screens can be used to absorb scattered radiation. Goggles designed for this purpose can be used to protect the eyes. Dosimeters do not offer protection from radiation. Rather, they measure radiation exposures. This is important because we have no sensors to detect ionizing radiation. During fluoroscopy, one dosimeter should be worn underneath the apron. Ring or bracelet dosimeters track the dose to the hands. One dosimeter should be worn on the collar above the apron to measure radiation to the eyes. 3 dosimeters may seem excessive, but it is good practice because the dose to these areas will vary. Part of radiation protection is thinking ahead to what might happen and preparing for those contingencies. In the case of dosimetry, one reality is that staff may work at more than one location. It is strongly recommended that those working at multiple locations have a different set of dosimeters for each workplace. In case of an unusual exposure, this will make it easier to determine where the exposure was received. If this is done, the dose recorded from each dosimeter must be communicated to the employee. There are 3 CNSC licensed service providers who report medical occupational dose to the National Dose Registry, or NDR. National Dosimetry Services, Health Canada, Landauer, and Mirion Technologies. The National Dose Registry keeps a record of individual cumulative dose over multiple licensed service providers and multiple employers. Because stochastic effects such as cancer have a long latency period, this service maintains these records for staff over their career, even if there's been a change in employer. The medical use of radiation has led to better imaging, diagnosis, and treatment of patients. As with any other tool with potential to cause harm, care must be taken in order to protect workers and members of the public. By developing and following reasonable workplace safety programs, these tools can be used with minimal worker exposure. In fact, the average annual dose received by those monitored for occupational exposures has been falling. For 2016, the last year on which this has been reported publicly, Health Canada reported an average worker dose of 0.2 millisieverts per year, well below the limits and the lowest level since reporting started in 1978. To find out more information particular to your workplace duties, there are several sources available. Research studies published in scientific journals are a good source, but are often behind paywalls and very technical or specific. For example, a 2020 study by Santos et al., published in the European Journal of Vascular and Endovascular Surgery, reported on radiation doses to staff in the hybrid operating room. They developed a set of 6 behavioral rules based on their findings. It is important to understand the quality of both the journal and the techniques used in the study when determining the value of the information provided in a journal article. Articles which use dose limits as numbers to approach and not cross over rather than following an ALARA approach are not in line with recommended radiation protection practices. There are several international agencies which monitor the scientific community and make recommendations to dose limits based on current scientific understanding. The International Council on Radiological Protection, mentioned previously, is one example. Our webinar on international agencies and regulatory bodies will cover these in more detail. Governments can choose to adopt their recommendations into regulation. Depending upon the regulator, the workplaces where there's potential exposure to ionizing radiation will have a radiation safety officer if regulated by the CNSC, or a safety officer responsible for X-ray safety if provincially regulated. The title of the X-ray safety officer varies by province. These officers are a good source of information particular to your workplace duties. The Radiation Safety Institute of Canada is also here to support any of your questions related to radiation safety, whether it be at work or at home. Founded in 1980, the Radiation Safety Institute of Canada is an independent, not-for-profit organization offering a variety of informational, consultation, and laboratory services focused on radiation safety. We hope you have enjoyed this introduction to radiation safety in the operating room. If you have any further questions about ionizing or non-ionizing radiation, please feel free to contact us toll-free at 1-800-263-5803 or by email at info@radiationsafety.ca. Visit us on the web at www.radiationsafety.ca or find us on Facebook.